All right, welcome. Today's discussion will be on a couple of the intricacies of the SRA training principle, stimulus recovery adaptation, and more particularly, we're going to talk about training frequency and how you can determine a good training frequency for, we'll say, a general strength training program, maybe a powerlifting program, and we'll talk a little bit about what frequency ranges are the best, probably, that range, and there's no optimal frequency, it doesn't exist. Or we'll talk about ranges that are the best, and we'll talk about possibilities of training way too infrequently, like let's say you want to do squats once a month and think you're going to dab like that, or training too frequently. Let's say you did a max out in squats twice a day, right? Maybe that wouldn't be such a good idea. So, to set up our talk about frequency, we have to mention that there are three primary, there's a fourth that I'm going to be covering in the powerlifting book, and we'll take care of all that later. There are three primary different SRA curves generated every single time you train. They are a technique curve, a hypertrophy curve, and a neural output ability to produce force through the nervous system curve. Every single time you train, which here's our little SRA graph, every single time you train, you are training your technique and your ability to set up correctly under the squat, under the bench press, for the deadlift, and actually carry out the techniques perfectly. If you guys notice, new beginners as opposed to old beginners, right? So beginners are not particularly good at techniques. How many of you guys have taught somebody to squat or bench or deadlift before? A bunch of us have taught, pretty much everyone else, right? You come to the gym one day, and the next day you're like, okay, do the squat. And they're like, okay. And you're like, okay, you don't remember anything, great. So technique is a big component of lifting because you have to have good technique to lift really well. Powerlifting is a very small technique component, but something like Olympic weightlifting has a huge technique component. You can't mess that stuff up, otherwise everything goes right to hell really quickly. Every time you train any lifts, your technical abilities are going to deteriorate after you practice them enough. They're going to supercompensate and lead to an adaptation sometime after you've trained them. And with technique, the SRA curves are very short. With a lot of technical movements, the SRA curves are measured in hours and not in days. So is it okay in a sport like basketball to have 2 technical sessions per day? Of course it is. Certainly it's okay to have them once a day, but as we notice with the SRA curve, after it goes through its whole cycle, what we didn't draw here is that you would continue to actually get worse if you didn't train technique fairly often. And since it's measured in hours and maybe days, do you know anybody that's gotten good at basketball playing it twice a week? What about lifting really heavy things? Have people gotten good lifting heavy things twice a week? You bet, right? So something that's very technical, you have to train it often, otherwise you just won't get that good at it. So every time you train, your technique component is going to be having its own SRA curve, right? In addition to that, at the same time, you're going to generate a hypertrophy SRA curve. So every time you train, a couple hours after you're done training, your fractional synthetic rate, which is the rate at which you grow muscle, that curve starts to rise and then it falls back to baseline. You've grown all the muscle you can from that session, and then you hypothetically hit it again, right? That's how you get the biggest muscles. Hypertrophy curves tend to take longer than technique curves. They're usually not measured in hours. Hours is how long it actually takes it to rise up to its initial level. And then, while you're growing muscle, you're still in that adaptive window. So the SRA curves for hypertrophy generally take between 2 and 4 days, depending on some factors. And we'll get a little bit into the kind of factors that matter. 2 and 4 days. So if you want the most hypertrophy you had probably better train the same muscle group between 2 and 4 days apart from each other. If you train a muscle group, 8 days later, its hypertrophy curve has fallen off a really long time ago and you've been doing a whole lot of nothing, actually probably shrinking muscle. But if you train every hour for hypertrophy, the curves come up and then they get directly interfered with by another curve and they actually go down and down and down and you get overreached and then you might get overtrained and all sorts of other bad stuff happens. So the frequency for hypertrophy is already lower than it is for technique. Now, neural output, /force characteristics, is your nervous system's ability to contract your muscles as hard as humanly possible. And there are a variety of neural mechanisms, especially at the spinal level and the brain level, that allow your nervous system to really free the beast. As soon as you free the beast, so to speak, and you train really heavy, that system takes a really huge hit and it takes a really long time to recover. Nervous system maximal force output characteristics are measured in multiple days to weeks. Okay? Some very good power lifters deadlift only once every 2 weeks heavy, because that's how long it takes their nervous system to recover and actually adapt. Now, how many people in this room, including myself, are training once every 2 weeks? That's nonsense, right? Our nervous systems are smaller, they're less adapted, we can't lift as much weight, we can't disturb homeostasis as much, but if you only train to always be your strongest every time you come to the gym, you probably show up to the gym anywhere between once every 5 or 8 days, all right? If you really wanted to feel great, how many of you guys feel great every single time you come into the gym? Nobody. What if you want to feel great every single time you come to the gym? Your nervous system characteristics are fully back online. It would take a while, okay? At that point, it becomes a suboptimal way to train, because by then your technique has degraded and your hypertrophy has degraded. Imagine if I told you you could only train every week and a half. First of all, technique. How would your squats feel if you haven't squatted at all in a week and a half? You'd walk the bar and you'd be like, oh yeah, my feet, oh, that's right. You'd forget how to squat every single time, all right? Especially if you're a beginner, and we'll get to that in just a second. How would your hypertrophy do? Okay, how long can you really make a muscle sore for? How long can you grow muscle for? We studied this topic in the scientific community. We figured out anywhere between 2 and 4 days, the muscle will grow under some pretty good circumstances. They've never documented any muscle growth in any study past like 4 days. Okay, it just really hasn't happened. So if you slam your quads with a ton of volume, every 8 days, they spend most of that time recovering, a little bit of that time growing, and then the rest of the 4 days after the first 4, they're just waiting around. And they don't just wait around. Remember, use it or lose it, they're actually going to start to shrink. So training once every 8 days for most outcomes is not a very good idea. We'll get to when it can be actually a good idea in just a second. So, we know all these independent Sra curves are generated. Now we have to ask, how do we train, what frequency do we train at, depending on our level of development. So let's just keep this conversation to strength training only. So obviously if you're training for sports, it's going to be more or less frequent depending on the demand. Level of development. Beginners, okay? The most important thing beginners can do is learn the technique. Just by learning how to move their body, they put pounds and pounds on the bar. They need a huge level of technical development. So, should beginners train more often than advanced people? Yeah, probably, because they need those technical Sra curves to really sum up to something. Right? Beginners, relative beginners, intermediates, the real way they're going to get super strong is by adding muscle size. How many 600-pound benchers do you guys know that weigh 150 pounds? Don't worry, they don't exist, okay? Wrong. Yeah, me, but, you know, if I weigh in like this with 1 foot, then yeah. Also, I don't bench 600. I was a lie in all cases. So, bad joke leading to lie, leading to embarrassment. So, if you're training to be the best lifter you can be, after you've established your level of technique that's pretty decent, you don't have to train all the time anymore, but you have to train pretty frequently to really maximize hypertrophy. So maybe if you start out a program to try to get better squats, squatting every day or 6 days a week is probably a really good idea. As you get to be more technically proficient in the squat and that settles in, hypertrophy is your ticket. So you might squat between 3 or 4 times a week, maybe 2 times a week if you already have really big quads. Now, as you get to be a really good lifter, you're going to get most of the muscle size that you're going to get, and any more you'd have to start training like a bodybuilder. Now you're really going to train your nervous system with super heavy, super taxing workouts to get it to really adapt and unleash all of this technique and hypertrophy you have at your disposal. All right? Then, as you get bigger and stronger and more advanced in your strength career, you tend to train a little bit less frequently, especially super heavy less frequently, because you really want to train this curve right here, the neural output curve. Then, you might have only one super heavy squat session once a week, and a lighter squat session just to maintain your technique and hypertrophy another time during that week. So you train legs twice a week, but only super hard once for the squats. Does that make sense? Cool. All right, so that's that for that discussion. And on a similar topic, thank you. Am I still in frame?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. All right. So the next question is, there's another influence on training frequency that you can potentially use. You say, okay, technically speaking, if I only do one set of squats per day, won't I recover enough? It'll be such a tiny little disruption that I could be recovered by the next day. But if I do 8 sets of squats per day, won't it take me a whole half week to recover and I can only train twice a week? That's absolutely completely correct. So another big influence on what frequency you're going to be doing, aside from your level of development of your needs, another big frequency determinant is how big are your individual sessions. And there's a lot of leeway there. If you want to do a squat everyday program and you're actually pretty advanced, no problem. You do 3 heavy squat sessions, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Tuesday, Thursday, you take it really easy to allow for recovery adaptation. And each one of those heavy sessions, it might be 1 or 2 really hard sets. And that's it, you leave the gym. Your total volume load is manageable, and each time you make a little tiny blip right here, okay? A tiny little blip, it heals fast, you come in, you squat again the next day, squat again the next day, all right? But if you have a really big workout and you make a real big blip, okay, you have to give it enough time to recover and adapt. So if your idea of squatting every day is doing 8 hard working sets, how long are you going to survive on a program like that? 2 days? You'll be hospitalized on day 3, okay? So you can adjust your session magnitudes within reason. There are 2 limiting factors on both sides. Factor number 1, let's say you think, okay, I want to train really frequently, so I'm going to do 50% of my 1 rep max for 1 rep once every hour. It's going to generate a tiny Sra curve, but they're all going to sum up over the course of years, and I don't need the man. Okay, what's the problem with that? What principle are we now violating? Overload. We're violating the overload principle. Is 50% of your 1 rep max going to get you really strong? For 1 rep? Are you kidding me? It's not that you'll recover in an hour, you will, but your body is only tallying stimuli that are going to make it really good. Okay, remember, the physiology doesn't want to change. It needs a real good message to change. It needs a homeostatic disruption of systems. How much are systems disrupted if you squat 50% of your 1 rep max for 1 rep? Your body's going to be like, it's never going to adapt. Nothing will happen. Okay? So that's bad. Your workouts have to be hard enough to disrupt homeostasis enough to even generate that bottom portion of the curve. If it's too easy and too frequent, I mean, if it's so frequent that you have to make each session really easy, then it's too frequent. So there is such a thing as too frequent. On the other end, too infrequent. Let's say you're like, all right, I'm a warrior and I love training hard, but I hate training really often because I don't really like training that much. I need big legs, so I'm going to train them once a month. But I'm going to mess them up so good that it's going to take a month to heal. It turns out that's a really big problem. Your body's adaptive capacity is limited. Its ability to actually heal from stressors and cause adaptations has a cap. All right, everyone's has a cap. If you take a ton of anabolic steroids, that cap actually goes up, okay? But then you can train more or less frequently, it doesn't really matter, it helps all causes. So you have a cap on how much you can adapt. If you train so hard that you disrupt physiology really far down, there's a chance it only recovers back up to normal baseline and you gain nothing. So essentially, if you squat with 20 total squat sets in 1 day, after a week, you're completely healed, but your body basically did a check of its systems and said, holy crap, the most I can do is survive this. Forget about adaptation. It's been so stunned that survival is the only option it has. Okay? If you really want to put high forces and stress on your body, and you really want to do it infrequently and get adaptation, why don't you just get into a car accident every 2 months? The forces are crazy. You'll get super. People's necks after car accidents get sore for like 3 weeks at a time. Delayed onset muscle soreness for 3 weeks at a time. Do you guys think they get really big necks like that? They go down, honey, neck training. Crash the car. Oh, yes. That's a good pump, right? It's too much for the system to recover from, right? So on the way far end of frequency, each session is too much for the system to adapt to, and it can only barely recover. And too close on the frequency spectrum, and we have a stimuli that's so ridiculously easy, the body won't even bother moving any adaptive processes for you. All right, but as long as your session magnitudes reflect your recovery times, as long as you feel relatively healed and you're following all the other training principles, you can train squats twice a week for most people, or you can train them 4 or 5 times a week, and as long as your curves are appropriately sized, allowing enough session-to-session recovery to benefit, you're totally cool. And from our discussion before, make sure you take your level of development into account. If you've been lifting for 5 years and you squat heavy one day and you squat light another day in the week and a new guy joins your group, put him on a higher frequency program because he's really going to benefit. He can join you because newbies get gains anyway, but why not get faster gains than slower gains? Make sense?